I never thought I would have to build a gate on my own driveway just to keep strangers from using my land. But that is exactly where things ended up. One morning, I stepped outside and found a line of cars driving across my property like my driveway was some kind of public road. And the craziest part was, they weren't lost. They were there on purpose, because someone decided my land was the easiest way to sell their houses faster. My name is Ethan Walker, and for most of my life, I never cared about having the biggest house on the street or the most expensive piece of property in town. I always wanted something simple, somewhere quiet, somewhere that felt like it belonged to me and my family. My home sits on a little over 2 acres outside a small rural community called Maple Ridge, Kentucky. It's an old white farmhouse that my grandfather built back in 1965, long before anyone was talking about luxury developments or private communities. Back then, there were just open fields, dirt roads, and neighbors who actually knew each other's names. My grandfather wasn't a rich man. He worked with his hands, saved every dollar he could, and built that house slowly over the years, one wall at a time. Behind the house sits an old red barn with faded paint and a small wooden bridge crossing the creek that runs along the edge of my property. That bridge was one of the things he was most proud of. He built it himself after a storm washed out the old path. And every time I crossed it, I could almost hear him saying the same thing he always said to me. Ethan, a piece of land isn't valuable because of what's sitting on it. It's valuable because of what people put into it. When I was younger, I thought that was just something old people said because they liked talking about the past. But as I got older, I started understanding what he meant. Land carries memories. It carries effort. It carries the stories of the people who came before you. And for years, my little corner of Maple Ridge was exactly what I wanted. Quiet mornings with coffee on the porch, the sound of birds instead of traffic, the occasional truck passing by on the gravel road, and evenings where the loudest thing you could hear was the wind moving through the trees. It wasn't fancy, but it was home. Then Pine Valley Estates came along. At first, I didn't think much about it. A development company bought several acres a few miles away and started building a new neighborhood. They put up signs promising peaceful country living, wide open spaces, and a quiet escape from the city. Honestly, I thought it might even be good for the area. New families would move in, local businesses would get more customers, and maybe the town would grow a little. I wasn't against progress. I wasn't the guy sitting on his porch yelling at anyone younger than him to stay away. But then I noticed something strange. The advertisements for Pine Valley Estates showed these beautiful homes surrounded by nature. And one thing kept appearing in their sales materials: easy access, convenient routes, peaceful surroundings. The kind of words real estate companies love using because they make people imagine a perfect life before they ever see the details. What they didn't mention was that part of their convenient access went straight through my driveway. I found that out on a Thursday morning. I was standing in my kitchen pouring coffee when I heard something I hadn't heard in years. Constant traffic. Not one vehicle. Not a neighbor stopping by. A steady stream of engines. At first, I thought there had been an accident on the main road and cars were being redirected. But when I looked out the window, I saw a shiny black SUV turning onto my gravel driveway. Then another car followed. Then another. They weren't slowing down. They weren't asking permission. They were driving right past my front porch, around my red barn, across the area near my old wooden bridge, and disappearing toward the side road behind my property. I just stood there for a moment because, honestly, my brain couldn't make sense of it. It was such a strange feeling. Like waking up and seeing someone parked inside your garage claiming they were just borrowing the space. I walked outside and waved my arms, trying to get someone's attention. The last vehicle finally stopped. The window rolled down, and sitting behind the wheel was a woman wearing a professional blazer, holding a stack of glossy brochures. She looked less like someone caught trespassing and more like someone who had been interrupted during a normal day at the office. "Can I help you?" she asked. I looked behind her at the line of cars sitting on my property and said, "Yeah, I think you can explain why there are strangers driving through my driveway." She gave a small smile. The kind people use when they think they're about to calm down a misunderstanding. We're just using the alternate access route for Pine Valley showings, she said. I actually laughed because I thought maybe I had heard her wrong. Alternate access route? She pulled out one of the brochures and opened a map. Then she pointed directly at my property. This path makes it easier for buyers to reach the homes. I looked down at that map, and there it was. My driveway, my bridge, my land, all marked like it was part of their development plan. I looked back at her and said, "You do realize this is private property, right?" Her smile faded slightly. We were told this was already approved. That sentence stayed with me, not because she said it confidently, but because of what it meant. Someone had made a decision about my property without ever talking to me. Someone had looked at my driveway, looked at their expensive housing projects, and decided my land was the missing piece in their plan. And right then, standing there with a line of vehicles behind her, I realized this wasn't a simple mistake. This was someone testing whether I would fight back, and they were about to learn they had chosen the wrong driveway. A few hours after that first encounter, I called the number listed for Pine Valley Estates and asked to speak with whoever was responsible for the project. The man who answered was named Marcus Hale, the developer behind the entire neighborhood. From the moment he picked up the phone, I could tell he was the kind of person who had spent years getting people to agree with him. His voice was calm, polished, almost too calm, like every conversation was just another negotiation he already knew how to win. He listened while I explained what was happening, and instead of sounding surprised, he sounded mildly inconvenienced. "Ethan, I understand your concern," he said, "but this is really just a temporary situation. We're waiting on county improvements to the main access road, and until then, this route helps everyone." I remember sitting there in my kitchen looking out at the driveway while he said that, because something about that sentence bothered me. Not the words themselves, the assumption behind them. He wasn't asking. He was explaining why something that affected my life had already been decided. "Everyone?" I asked. "Who exactly does this help?" There was a short pause. "The community," he replied. That answer almost made me smile because it was the kind of answer people give when they want their own benefit to sound like a public service. I told him, "Marcus, your buyers are getting a shortcut. Your company is saving time and money. But I'm the one dealing with strangers driving through my yard every day." He gave a small laugh, not a loud laugh, not openly disrespectful, but the kind of laugh that tells you someone thinks you're making a bigger deal out of something than you should. "Ethan, we're talking about a driveway," he said. "It's not like we're taking your land." And maybe that was the moment things changed for me, because he was right about one thing. They weren't taking the land, not officially. They weren't putting up fences or moving survey markers. They were doing something much harder to fight. They were slowly acting like they already had permission. They were turning my property into something everyone assumed belonged to them. After we hung up, I sat there for a long time thinking about what my grandfather had told me. A lot of people think property disputes are always about money, but sometimes they're about something much smaller and much deeper. Sometimes it's about being ignored. Sometimes it's about someone deciding your voice doesn't matter. The next morning, I started looking into everything. I went down to the county records office, pulled old documents, and spent hours going through property maps that looked like they were printed before I was born. I wasn't looking for a fight. I was looking for the truth, because if there was some legal access agreement I didn't know about, I wanted to see it. If my grandfather had ever signed something giving people permission to cross the property, I wanted to respect that. I wasn't interested in being difficult. I just wanted to know what was real. The county clerk, an older woman named Linda, helped me search through the records. After almost an hour, she looked up from the screen and said something that made my stomach drop. "Well, this is interesting." She turned the monitor toward me. There was no easement, no recorded access agreement, no legal right for Pine Valley Estates, their buyers, or anyone else to use my driveway. The small wooden bridge my grandfather built decades earlier was completely inside my property boundaries. The gravel path they were treating like a public road was mine, every inch of it. I remember walking back to my truck that afternoon feeling strange. Part of me felt relieved because I finally knew where I stood, but another part of me felt angry because this meant Marcus hadn't made a mistake. Someone at that company had looked at the maps. Someone had planned this. They had simply hoped nobody would challenge them. Over the next few days, I started noticing even more traffic. Real estate agents would drive through slowly, pointing at houses and telling potential buyers how convenient the location was. Some people waved at me like we were neighbors. Others didn't even look in my direction. One couple actually stopped near my barn and took pictures because they thought the view was beautiful. I walked over and asked if they knew they were standing on private property. The husband looked embarrassed. The realtor said this was part of the community access. I almost felt bad for them because they weren't the problem. They were just being told a story. The problem was the person writing that story. 2 days later, I made my decision. I called a local fencing company and asked them to come out. The owner, Ray, had worked around farms his entire life. When I explained what I wanted, he looked at the property and said, "You sure about this? Once that gate goes in, things are going to get interesting." I looked down the driveway where dozens of strangers had driven without permission and said, "That's exactly why it needs to go in." The next morning, trucks arrived. Steel posts were driven deep into the gravel. A heavy black metal gate, nearly 10 feet tall, was installed across the entrance. It wasn't some cheap decorative fence. It was built to last, strong enough to stop vehicles, but more importantly, strong enough to send a message. This wasn't about revenge. This wasn't about causing trouble. This was about making something clear that apparently needed to be said. My property was not an extension of their business plan. The final touch was a keypad system installed on the inside of the gate. I didn't want strangers controlling access. I didn't want a public code passed around to hundreds of people. The only person who could open that gate was me. That Friday afternoon, right on schedule, the realtor came back with another group of potential buyers. I watched from my porch as the first SUV rolled up the driveway. They probably expected the same easy route they had used all week. They probably expected nobody to stop them. Then the gate came down. A heavy metal sound echoed across the property. The kind of sound that tells people something has changed. The realtor stepped out of her vehicle and stared at the gate. Then she looked at me standing near the porch. Her face went from confusion to anger in a matter of seconds. "You can't do this," she shouted. I just looked at her and said, "Watch me." For the first time since this whole thing started, nobody had a brochure, nobody had a sales pitch, and nobody had a shortcut. They had a locked gate, and they finally had to deal with the fact that my driveway was never theirs to use. The first thing Marcus Hale did after that gate went up was call me, and I could hear the frustration in his voice before he even finished saying hello. The smooth confidence he had during our first conversation was gone. The developer who had once sounded like he had every answer suddenly sounded like someone who had just realized the plan he spent months building had one problem he couldn't simply push aside. Me. "Ethan, we need to talk about this," he said. I was standing by the kitchen window looking out at that black steel gate sitting across my driveway. The same driveway hundreds of people had crossed without asking. And I remember thinking how strange it was that a simple piece of metal had done what weeks of conversations couldn't. It had made people stop. "About what exactly?" I asked. There was a pause. "About the access situation. You're creating complications for the development." I almost smiled when I heard that, because just a few days earlier, my entire life had been the complication nobody cared about. My mornings had been interrupted. My property had been used. My concerns had been brushed aside. But now that their shortcut was gone, suddenly it was a problem. "Marcus," I said, "a week ago, you told me this was temporary and that everyone benefited. Now you're telling me it's a problem because you can't use it anymore." He tried to explain that the neighborhood depended on that route. He talked about buyers, schedules, construction crews, and the importance of keeping things moving. But every argument came back to the same thing. They needed my driveway because it was easier. It was cheaper. It saved them time. And that's when I realized something important. This was never about access. It was about convenience. They weren't asking whether they could use my land. They were asking why I was making it difficult for them to continue doing what they had already decided to do. Finally, Marcus brought up the word that everyone uses when they want to make something sound bigger than it is: emergency access. He said the gate could create safety concerns. He said there could be situations where people needed that road. So I asked him the same question I had been waiting to ask since the beginning. Marcus, if this is an emergency access route, where is the recorded easement? The line went quiet. I could hear him breathing on the other end. I'm sure our attorneys can work something out, he finally said. And that answer told me everything I needed to know. Because if there was a legal right to use my driveway, he would have shown it to me immediately. There would have been paperwork. There would have been documents. There would have been proof. Instead, there was only negotiation. And negotiation means you don't already own something. A few days later, I met with a local attorney named Rachel Morgan. She wasn't the kind of lawyer who walked into a room trying to start a fight. She was practical, calm, and honestly, she reminded me a lot of my grandfather. She looked at the documents, reviewed the property records, and said something I will never forget. Eaton, the strongest position you have is that you never refuse to cooperate. You simply refused to be ignored. That sentence stuck with me because that was exactly how I felt. I wasn't trying to stop growth. I wasn't against new neighbors. I wasn't some angry old man protecting his driveway just because he could. I actually liked the idea of more families moving into the area. What bothered me was that nobody thought they needed to include me in the conversation. They looked at my land on a map and saw an empty line between two roads. They didn't see the years my grandfather spent maintaining it. They didn't see the mornings I spent walking across that bridge as a kid. They didn't see the reason I wanted to live there in the first place. After the legal notice was sent, something interesting happened. The cars stopped completely. The same road that had been full every morning became quiet again. The same driveway that had turned into a highway became just a driveway. And I'll admit something. The silence felt better than I expected. I sat outside one evening watching the sunset over the creek. And, for the first time in weeks, I felt like I had my home back. But then, about a month later, Marcus came back. This time, he didn't come with excuses. He didn't come with pressure. He came with an offer. He admitted that the company needed reliable access. And after speaking with his team, they wanted to make everything official. The proposal was simple: $3,000 up front, plus $1,500 every month, in exchange for legal access through the property. I looked at that offer for a long time. Not because of the money. Honestly, the money wasn't part that mattered. What mattered was the fact that they were finally treating me like the owner of my own land. They were finally asking instead of assuming. And that difference changes everything. I agreed, but only after everything was written down clearly. The agreement explained exactly where they could drive, when they could use it, and what responsibilities they had. No vague promises. No handshake deals. No, we thought it was okay. Everything had a line, a signature, and a record. Because that's the thing about boundaries. Sometimes people only respect them when you make them impossible to ignore. When the gate stayed there after the agreement was signed, Marcus actually asked if I planned to remove it. I told him no. That gate wasn't built because I hated anyone. It wasn't built because I wanted revenge. It was built because sometimes a physical reminder is the only way people understand where one person's rights end and another person's begin. Today, that driveway is still there. The old wooden bridge still crosses the creek. The red barn still stands where my grandfather built it almost 60 years ago. And every once in a while, I still see cars from Pine Valley Estates passing through. But now they slow down at the gate. They enter properly. They know exactly whose property they are on. Looking back, I think the biggest lesson wasn't about a driveway, a developer, or even a gate. It was about how easily people can convince themselves that something belongs to them simply because they need it. A shortcut becomes an access road. A favor becomes an expectation. Silence becomes permission. And sometimes the hardest thing you have to do is remind someone that being convenient doesn't make something yours. But I also know there are people who will see this story differently. Some will say I should have worked with the developer from the beginning. Some will say Marcus was just trying to solve the problem and keep a project moving. Others will say nobody has the right to use private property without permission, no matter how convenient it is. And honestly, that's why I want to hear what you think. Was I wrong for putting up the gate? Or was that the only way to make them respect my property? If you were in my position, would you have negotiated first? Or would you have done exactly what I did? Leave your thoughts in the comments, because these property battles are never just about land. They're about respect, responsibility, and where we draw the line between helping others and allowing ourselves to be taken advantage of. And if you enjoy real lifestyle stories about neighbors, property disputes, and the moments when ordinary people have to stand up for what is theirs, make sure to share this video with someone who would have an opinion on this one, because sometimes the smallest gate can tell the biggest story.